But welcome everybody. We're very excited to be here. My name is Liz Maurer. I'm a representative here of the museum, and I'm so pleased that you've all chosen to spend your lunch hour with us today, talking about Bob Hope. So Bob Hope entertained thousands of troops at hundreds of bases over a decades-long career in the United Service Organizations Partnership. And his show mixed comedy, music, and popular culture to bring relief to exhausted troops serving overseas. And we're talking about this today because we have a special exhibition about Bob Hope's time entertaining troops during World War II. I am pleased to introduce you to the museum's chief curator, Paul Morando, who will be facilitating a discussion with the curator of So Ready for the Laughter, The Legacy of Bob Hope.
Greetings, welcome. This is interesting to talk to people in the room and talk to our guest speaker who's far away, and then also everyone who's online. So this is kind of a fun process. So Liz, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for putting this program together. So what we're going to do is really have a conversation, right? Curator to curator in terms of how this exhibit and the importance of Bob Hope and what it means, obviously, not only to the National World War II Museum, but of course, for the National Museum of the United States Army. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Kim Guise. She is the Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the National World War II Museum. She's been part of that team since 2008. And one of the many exhibitions that she has curated is So Ready for Laughter, The Legacy of Bob Hope. And of course, that exhibit is here currently at the National Army Museum. Now, her specialties include wartime correspondence and American POWs in Europe and the Pacific. And her current work, Our War II, Women in. I think it's very, very interesting to focus on. She focuses on American service during World War II. So I want to for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for that introduction. I know this is kind of new territory or old territory with a live audience and a virtual one. So thank you.
So I want to start with some questions, kind of basic. We'll have like a nice little sort of fireside chat, if you will, little banter back and forth. But first, can you just tell us a little bit about the World War II Museum for those who would like to know?
Sure. Well, I am here in my office in New Orleans. So the National World War II Museum is in New Orleans, Louisiana. We opened as the National D-Day Museum in 2000, and we have grown. We received the congressional designation as the National World War II Museum in 2004. And that was with the support of a great number of World War II veterans who were still in the federal government at the time and still very active. So that was 2004. We became the National World War II Museum, and we have been expanding ever since. So right now in New Orleans, we have a 6-acre campus. We have 6 buildings, and we're still growing. There's a hotel right across the street, the Higgins Hotel. So it allows our visitors to spend the night and spend a couple of days here with us exploring, the vast topic of World War II. So our mission here at the National World War II Museum is to tell the story of the American experience in World War II. And that's a giant mission. To tell that story, we call on, as curators, I'm going to talk about our collection a lot, right? We have a great number of artifacts from American veterans of World War II. Many of those were donated initially by the veterans themselves and then also by their families now more often. So we have around 250,000 objects in our collection, and that grows every single day. You can probably see some of the collections behind me. So we're still collecting. We also have a large number of oral histories with those who lived through World War II. So with veterans, with individuals who experienced the war on the home front, with workers in production, et cetera. So that's who we are in a very brief nutshell. I encourage anyone who has not visited us to please do so. As we have permanent exhibits here on campus that include things like a B-17 and a World War II PT boat, PT-305, that was made here in New Orleans by Higgins Industries. So we have large artifacts like those pieces on display. We have permanent galleries devoted to the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe, the American home front. And then we also have rotating exhibits and special exhibits. Some of those we produce ourselves in-house, and some of those we rely on colleagues. We share exhibits and borrow exhibits from other individuals like you've done with So Ready for Laughter.
That's great. Yeah, I've been to your museum, and it's just fantastic, very impressive. And get down there and check it out. So you're talking about stories, right? So what's the story behind this exhibit? How did it come to be? Anything you can share that would be helpful to us?
Sure. Well, sort of the origin of this is we did host, I mentioned that we host traveling exhibits from other institutions as well. And we hosted an exhibit on Bob Hope previously. And that exhibit was called Bob Hope, an American Treasure. And it was put together by the World Golf Hall of Fame and Museum, who had was home to some of Bob Hope's artifacts and stories. And so they had an exhibit that they traveled for a number of years, and that was on Bob Hope's life overall. It focused also on his golfing and his relationship, of course, through the World Golf Hall of Fame. But we hosted that exhibit here on site in 2013. So there was quite a response to the exhibit. Of course, we, having the focus on World War II, wanted more of that story included on campus. And that was the origin of Bob's connection to the troops, was his performances, his experiences during World War II. So we really wanted to expand on that part of his life, that central part of his mission, his story. And so that was where the idea for the exhibit was born.
And it's great. And I know, we've kind of been working together in terms of, laying out the logistics and finalizing the design when we brought this exhibit in. Is it typical for museums to kind of work with outside partners to develop, develop exhibits? Is that a normal thing?
Yes, it's a frequent practice, I would say. We have all kinds of collaborators, whether and stakeholders. When we feature material in our exhibits, I mentioned our artifact owners that are often World War II veterans and their families. In this instance, many of the artifacts that are featured in So Ready for Laughter are from the Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation. And their chair and CEO is Linda Hope, daughter of Bob Hope. And so she is the child of the collection subject of the honorary veteran Bob Hope. And so she's a natural partner. And so those, artifact donors and family members of individuals featured are a partner. Museums also rely on other institutions for material, for expertise, for information, and also, outside experts. So on various projects, we often use advisors advisors who have worked on similar subjects, or Paul, you mentioned Our War II, the exhibit on women in service that I am working on now currently. And we have a large number of women veterans and scholars who focus, and museum professionals from the Military Women's Museum and Memorial and the Army Women's Museum, who are advising us. So it's very common for museums and museum professionals and curators to call on their partners and other individuals.
Yeah, and I totally agree. When I did a presentation about sort of this exhibit in terms of how a traveling exhibit comes together, how do you get it from other institutions, the partnerships and things like that. And yeah, you're right. We quite often reach out to other museums, other curators who have expertise in things of that nature. So in talking about that, why choose us, the National Museum of the United States Army? I can tell you why, but maybe they want to hear.
I'd like to hear your answer too, but I think you're a natural fit for this exhibition. I feel you are I think a great number of your staff, your volunteers, and the individuals who come through the museum likely have some kind of connection, perhaps even a personal one, to Bob Hope. And we saw that here at the National World War II Museum, where some of our volunteers, where many of our visitors, while going through the exhibit, would reminisce about having seen Bob Hope while in service or otherwise. And we also, so the National Museum of the U.S. Army is actually the third venue for So Ready for Laughter. It premiered at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio, and then went to the Gulf Quest National Museum, Maritime Museum of the Gulf of Mexico. And that's been one interesting thing about this exhibition, is that Bob Hope touched so many lives and his story is so large. He had played a role in many different aspects of American life through, the entire century of his lifetime, that his story fits almost anywhere. You can draw some connection, but certainly the National Museum of the U.S. Army is a natural fit.
Yeah, and certainly, kind of walking through that exhibit and, looking at visitor reaction, they're certainly making a connection. And video is so important. And the video that accompanies this exhibit, that's sort of the heart of the exhibit. People are really engaged with that. And then, of course, you want them to connect with the objects, the artifacts that are out there. And I know there's like a diary that he kept, where he's kind of practicing material, writing down jokes, and people are connecting with that to see, the sort of creative aspect of comedy, right? But also how it applies to a military audience. And I think there are those who, even today, whether recent veterans or current soldiers, they're still part of that USO experience, right? That there is still, the idea of entertainment while being deployed. And obviously it started with Bob Hope. And that's where I kind of want to turn my questions to really focus in on Bob Hope himself. But how did he get his start as a military entertainer?
I think it was somewhat reluctantly. He mentions, the title of the exhibit, So Ready for Laughter, is drawn from a quote from Bob Hope. And he said, "We had no idea we were going to discover an audience so ready for laughter. It would make what we did for a living seem like stealing money." So they had no idea what they were walking into. And that referred to their first performances, his troop's first performances for military audiences. And that happened before America entered World War II, right before. And that was in May 1941. at Marchfield in California. And the Bob Hope was already a big star at the time. He had his weekly radio show, the Pepsonant radio show starring Bob Hope. And that was a tremendously popular radio program heard by Americans all over the country. And so Bob was asked to bring his radio show, to perform the show in front of a military audience at Marchfield. And he said, oh, yeah, I guess so. It was sort of an arm twisting. And but it was, the effect, the audience that they discovered there, they were hooked. And when by the time we entered the war, they were performing most of their performances in front of military audiences. So it was a weekly radio show. The radio season was 38 weeks long. And during the war, only 9 of Hope's wartime performances were performed in the studio. So all of the others were performed in front of live military audiences. So he didn't look back after that moment.
Right. And that kind of leads, the Army is all about logistics, right? It's a big part of, sort of running an army. And you mentioned that Bob Hope was, and his troop and his, sort of cast of entertainers, they went to some very dangerous places. So how as entertainers, how do they, to tell us a little bit about the logistics of getting from, those places?
Sure. I mean, Bob Hope flew in nearly every type of military aircraft during the war, and also on nearly every type of watercraft as well. So his troop took a variety of modes of transport to get to where they were to perform for troops. And often they were traveling with the troops. So, they were just traveling alone to these locations was quite dangerous. They didn't have special accommodations. They were using the military transportation to get to these venues. Sometimes, one of the little things I can tell you to look out for when you go into the gallery later, we have an interactive table where you can follow along some of Bob Hope's performances in 1943 and 1944. And in the Pacific, so we had to plot where Hope's troop performed, the number of miles that they traveled and the different venues that they went to. And some of these locations were so small, they were difficult to even plot onto a map. So, they're specks on a map. And so they used any method to get to where the troops were to perform. I
know there's one particular kind of piece in that film, right? They talk about this place called Pavuvu, right? Can you maybe explain a little bit more about that and or at least that scene in the film, which I think is very, very powerful in terms of what he did to kind of bring some joy or some entertainment to that kind of faraway place.
Sure. And that was one performance that is referenced in the film, that is referenced throughout, in almost any book or article or about Bob Hope's performances in World War II. So that's his performance on Pavuvu for troops of the 1st Marine Division. And they were staging there for the invasion of Peleliu. They had been there for some time and were about to go into and let's just say, one of the worst battles. And so they were asked to come to this little island to perform, but there was no airstrip even big enough for their regular, C-47 or however they were traveling to land there. So they went in a Piper Cub. So, they traveled, basically the pilot took one of them, landed them, went back, picked up another one, landed them again. So, it took them a little while to get there, but they put on a performance that was unforgettable for those who managed to live through the terrible invasion. Later on, Hope and his troop learned that a large percentage of the troops that were there did not survive. And that's something that had an impact on the entire troop also for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful. And then, the story doesn't end in World War II in terms of what Bob Hope has done, and kind of mentioned in the introductions and things like that. So, obviously he continued to do military shows. What was that experience like in terms of going beyond World War II and obviously Vietnam and Desert Storm and things like that?
Yeah, and because we are the National World War II Museum, our focus in So Ready for Laughter is really where he got his start in his military performances and his time in World War II, and how those performances shaped his life. But he had a long life after World War II. He died in 2003, and he was performing up until his late 80s or mid to late 80s, really, during Operation Desert Shield. And some of his last performances were in Saudi Arabia, in the Persian Gulf. And so he, the germ, I guess, of this, of his mission was in World War II. But Bob Hope is kind of a through line, I think, for a lot of the American conflicts and wars in the 20th century. So individuals who saw Bob Hope in Vietnam report very similar stories and remember those performances in remarkably similar ways to individuals who saw Bob in World War II. So it really is it's not only echoes of the same experience, it's almost the same experience. I think in later years, as transportation did become more advanced, and Bob was maybe even able to go closer to the action, say in Vietnam. I recall speaking with one of your volunteers who actually flew Bob in Vietnam to one of his performances in a helicopter. And so, I think the advances in aviation allowed him to get even closer to some of the sites of action and danger.
I think that's, I think what resonated with service members about him, that, obviously entertaining, that's a big part of what he's doing. But he also, like you kind of mentioned, had that way of personally connecting with whether individual soldiers. And in fact, one of the things that he did was, the soldiers asked him to kind of pass along personal messages, right, to their families back home. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's, talking to Bob Hope's daughter, Linda, she mentioned how when her dad would come home, she remembered as a little girl, he would come home from some of these trips entertaining, and he would spend hours and hours on the telephone because people would slip him their wife's name or their mother's name and say, please contact them, let them know I'm okay. And he would actually make phone calls to individuals and pass along that message. So he earned a reputation as ambassador to the troops, and that he really was, the connections that he made with his audiences, his military audiences, didn't end when he left the stage. So he maintained a strong connection with them, like I said, through the phone, but more often through the mail. Individuals would write him, and the Hope Foundation is still receiving letters from individuals who saw Bob Hope, long years, decades after his death. They're still receiving letters, but he would receive letters from individuals, thank you letters, basically saying, thank you for coming to see us. We'll never forget this performance. It was so funny. Come back again. Or he would receive letters from wives and mothers of sisters, brothers of service personnel who had seen Bob Hope. Sometimes, saying thank you for performing for him. He told me about seeing you. Thank you. Sometimes asking him, can you tell me more about where my son is? Thinking that maybe Bob could get around the censorship rules. They couldn't quite say where they were. They would just write somewhere in the Pacific. So people would write Bob Hope, hey, can you tell me where that performance was? Because I want to know where my son is. Of course, he couldn't say exactly either, but yeah, so he really was, people identified with him personally. It wasn't the letters that were sent to him were not, in most instances, were not formal letters, and they were very personal, as if they were talking to a friend or someone that they knew. And Bob wrote back. that was another thing. He made those phone calls,
Right.
and he actually responded to as many letters as possible. He was receiving mountains of mail during the war. His radio show, the Pepsodent Show, held the #1 spot during the war years, and he was tremendously popular. So he was receiving mountains of mail. And with the help of his assistant and secretary, he did, wade through that mountain of mail and respond to as many letters as possible.
And then some of those letters made it into the exhibit, right? In terms of that's on display or used in some kind of graphic. And that kind of brings me to my next question, and a question that I often get asked a lot here, right? How did you make choices, or how did you decide what to exhibit, and certainly what stories to tell?
That's one of the toughest jobs I think that we have as curators, is to often whittle down the material that we choose to display, and whittle down the words. Certainly that we say it. We can't. It's not a book. We're not presenting a book here. We're not, this is not a lecture or a course. It's an exhibit. So you have to make selections. And that is selections about what you say, selections about what is included in a case. There's only so much space that we have for this story. And selections begin with, what is the story? Are we going to stray into the war? How much can we say about his post-war performances if this story is about his World War II experience? So, thinking about what material will resonate with an audience, and sometimes testing that out with our colleagues or with audience members, with user groups. But it's often what resonates most with me, and trying to enable others to have that connection and experience also. So you work with the material that you have at your disposal. If you don't have it, you can call on colleagues who might be able to loan material. We have a couple of pieces in the exhibit actually that are on loan from other institutions. So we have a couple of pieces from the National Museum of Naval Aviation that's in Pensacola, Florida. So there are a couple of other loan pieces in there. So you use the material you have at hand. You can borrow material from other institutions, and you try to tell the best story that you can. So it's about storytelling, really, and making those choices. You know, a lot of the editing, I said it's not a book, but the editing process is often very, very similar. You have lots of editors. There are a lot of people who read this content before it was produced. And so, and I'm thankful for that.
Absolutely. And speaking of stories, I'm seeing a lot of stuff in the chat about their own, people's own stories or reflections of Bob Hope. And I want to, sort of the last question to you, and it's something that I really wanted to ask you, and I don't think I have ever had in terms of what's your takeaway from this exhibit? What did you learn about and not, from Bob Hope's story, but also the exhibit itself?
I think one of the things, and we've touched on this a lot, is the power of Hope's performance. Of course, I remember Bob Hope as a TV personality, watching his shows on TV, but I never saw Bob as I never saw him while in service, far away from home, in a dangerous situation. So it's hearing from individuals who have had those experiences, whether it's people, accounts of those who witnessed Bob Hope in World War II, or individuals like your volunteer who had the opportunity to fly Bob Hope to a performance in Vietnam. And then volunteers here at the National World War II Museum who talked about seeing Bob Hope at Christmas time, December 1970 in Vietnam. And those, it's hearing about the power and the energy of his performances. So thinking about energy, that's another thing, it's the real power of laughter. Laughter's in the title, right, of the exhibit. And Linda Hope talks a lot about how laughter it was an exchange of energy. It gave her dad energy because Bob, the number of performances that he and the troupe gave during World War II is astounding. And in his lifetime, it's estimated that he entertained 11 million troops. So just how did he have all of that energy? And according to his daughter, it was really laughter energized him. It's what gave him it motivated him to continue on. So those are a couple of things: the power of laughter, the emotional power of that connection to the troops, and the staying power of those performances. And then also there are a couple of very powerful stories, about the personal connection. And one, you've already touched on this, one of the letters that we have in the exhibit. It's from a mother of a Marine who was killed in the invasion of Peleliu. So he wrote his mom telling her about Hope's performance and how it was top notch, and it was, it was fun for him. And so she wrote Bob Hope, informing him of her son's death and thanking him for giving her 19-year-old son those few moments of fun in, the last weeks of his life. So it's those kinds of personal connections and the power of those that really was my main takeaway from the show.
Yeah, thank you for sharing and for sharing that. And I think that also resonates with not only our, sort of volunteers who had that interaction or that experience, but visitors as well who come through the exhibit. And so, thank you for being a part of this and sort of answering my questions and things like that. Now we want to turn it over to the audience to ask Kim, any questions? Good question. Kim, the question was, where does the exhibit go after the National Army Museum?
So the exhibit is going in February. The exhibit will go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History. I talked about kind of the fit everywhere. So that's the next venue. And then it will travel to Portland, Oregon at the Oregon Historical Society. So we have a couple of venues lined up.
Great. Thank you. Great question. Anybody else in the room have something before I go virtual? We could always come back if you have something. So some that have come in, and this is a question we've had, or maybe a comment, and you kind of touched upon it before, is are there any plans to expand the exhibit to cover his post-World War II involvement?
There are no plans to expand this exhibit, given our focus on World War II here at the National World War II Museum. There are no plans to expand this exhibit. However, we do, as curators, I think we because our space in an exhibit is often very limited, we try other ways to cover different parts of the story that you have to leave out of the main exhibit. So while the exhibit won't be expanded, we have articles on our website, on the website of the National World War II Museum, that address certain other parts of Hope's life, his Christmas performances throughout time. Those aren't really discussed in the exhibit, but I have written about that. And also, so through these other methods, we do have tried to expand and move into that area, but for the exhibit, no.
Thank you for that. So I want to call out a couple of folks who are online who have actually seen Bob Hope live, right? There's Dan, who actually saw Bob Hope at the Kennedy Center with President Reagan. How amazing is that? So Dan, thank you for sharing that story. And then also Lawrence, who actually saw Bob Hope in Thailand. So thank you both Dan and Bob for sharing that. And we also have volunteers here at Namusa Volunteers who saw Bob Hope live as well. Dave, one of our volunteers, saw him twice. And then Edward actually met Bob Hope at his college graduation. So once again, as you were saying, those connections are real, and obviously made an impression certainly on those folks who talked about that. And so we have another question. I think it's a good question. Did you know much about Bob Hope before you started this exhibit?
I knew some about Bob Hope. Of course, being a history nerd as a child, I was a big fan of old movies, right? So I had seen a lot of Hope's films. So I knew him from his movies and from his television performances. But I wasn't an expert on Bob Hope before I embarked on this project. Now I know a tremendous amount of Bob Hope, and I've spent years learning about Bob Hope, but there is a tremendous amount of material about Bob out there. He lived for 100 years, and he wrote about his life and talked about his own life a lot. Almost everyone who performed with Bob Hope in the war years wrote about their experiences. Francis Langford, who was a central part of his troupe. Jerry Colonna also wrote about his experiences. So there is a lot, and there are some very comprehensive volumes about Bob's life and his work out there, some great books. So there's a lot of information out there, and a lot to learn always.
And the next question that has kind of popped up and kind of leads to what you were just talking about. Who were some of the sort of his fellow performers that with him? So we obviously focus on Bob Hope, but he had a whole cast of entertainers who were fairly popular in their own right, correct? And maybe obviously became more popular because of him. Can you talk about them?
Sure, yeah. He had a cast, a sort of a standard cast that he would call upon to go on his troop, on his tours during World War II. And so you see the same people in lots of the films from the wartime. And I mentioned one earlier, Frances Langford. She's, beautiful songstress. She traveled with him. Patty Thomas was the youngest member of the troupe. She's a young dancer. She turned 21 on, I think, Christmas Island in 1944, in the summer of 1944. So she accompanied Bob a lot during the war years. Jerry Colonna is the individual that traveled with Hope for many, many years, beginning in World War II, but then into, the Vietnam era. He was a multi-instrumentalist, trombone player, comedian. And so and Tony Romano was his guitar player. They called him the orchestra. He often was the only accompaniment that they had. So they were the central cast basically during the war years. But, if you look at sort of the Hope photo archives over time, almost everybody performed with Bob Hope. Mr. T, I don't know, like anyone that you can think of. Certainly, Raquel Welch was known for performing with him. Brooke Shields is featured in the film that we have in So Ready for Laughter. She did some tours with him later years. So he certainly called upon popular stars of the day when he was going to perform with the USO.
That's great. So I think that does it for our online questions, and I want to give the folks in the room another chance for any last minute questions before we end this program. Anybody out in the room have anything else to chat about? Sir. Oh, yeah, it's a good question, Kim. The question was, are there any future traveling exhibits that the World War II Museum has that may come to the National Army Museum in the future?
That's a question for you. No, we do have several exhibits that are traveling the country right now. So if not at the National Museum of the U.S. Army, you may have a chance to see some of those at other venues. We have the Ghost Army, combat con artist of World War II, that is currently out in Skokie, Illinois. We have an exhibit called Fighting for the Right to Fight on African American service in World War II that is traveling the country. We have an exhibit called Manufacturing Victory on home front activities. And then the exhibit that I mentioned earlier, Our War II Women in Service, that will actually travel as well after it appears here at the National World War II Museum. So often we're the host of the initial run, as we were with So Ready for Laughter, and then we shepherd it on to venues around the country.
Wow, great potential exhibits. We have another question, and we'll talk about those too, Kim. There's a question in the chat. Let me take a look and see if I can grab it. No, it's on the screen. Yeah, here we go. That's amazing how that happens. So did he do many shows on ships? That was a question. An audience member online remembers seeing a video of him in sort of late 1960s doing a show on an aircraft carrier.
He did do performances pretty much everywhere. He did them on ships, on docks, on stages of all kinds. So yes.
Good. Yeah, no, great question. And I think that does it for our questions. And I really want to thank you, Kim, for being part of this, taking the time out to kind of share your experience, your expertise in developing this exhibit and designing it. Once again, Kim, thank you very, very much. It's been, it's so interesting to hear your perspective. We've worked together. We've, in terms of things that we really never had a chance to kind of sit down and talk in this forum. So I do now get a deeper appreciation for what you've done for this exhibit in terms of your expertise and how you select artifacts and also how you develop a traveling exhibit. And it's something that's going to help my team as we try to develop traveling exhibits in the future. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the folks online and the folks in the room.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me, Paul. And thank you for hosting So Ready for Laughter.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.